Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Hope you got some lunch or have some plans afterwards. So I'm Dave Ward from Cisco. You may recognize me from several other mic events, but I just want to say my very short host welcome at the aquarium and my very short plenary welcome. I now get to have a full allotment of time, and you are a captive audience. So I now get to talk about a few things. So what I want to talk about today was something that I talked about at IETF 91 3 years ago, and had been doing quite a bit of work in open source and trying to create a relationship between standards bodies and open source communities and how they can interplay together. And so that's what we'll talk about today. Where are we 3 years later, frankly, on both sides of the coin? Maybe I need to be closer. This just worked. Aha, there we go. So why should you care what I have to say? Maybe you don't, doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, but let's just have a conversation about this. A brief narcissistic moment. Many of you recognize me from working here at the IETF where I was routing AD and did a bunch of chairs and drafts and stuff like that. But I haven't been around the last couple of years. And the last couple of years, my team has been working here, but I've been working in open source. And for what it's worth, what you can see up there are a number of boards that I'm on and communities and foundations that I've worked on. I work on directly, have catalyzed, and really my intention from an industry perspective was to create a developer community around networking, as well as to reduce some of the confusion that was out there about, and this is during, as we're still in the SDN era, the NFV era, and so forth, now telemetry and a variety of other things that have evolved here, and get people coding towards this. So just like at the IETF, open source and Cisco as a company, we can't go any faster than our customers. And our customers were trying to understand what SDN, controllers, NFV, orchestration, et cetera, data, big data and what it means for networking. They were trying to understand what it means for them. And if we, as an industry, can't go faster than our customers or the operators can absorb that technology, we needed to take a turn, or I felt we needed to take a turn to give them the tools, education, technology to learn this along with us as an industry. Needless to say, myself and no one in this room has the key for what SDN is, should be, will be, and how it will be deployed. It is an evolution, and we've seen that over the last 8 years. And so what I wanted to do now, going on about 6 years ago, was also reduce the fracturing in the industry, at that time around SDN and NFV, because the industry was just exploding with controllers and there was a predominance of one particular protocol, no subjective statements about that protocol, but nonetheless, that protocol was not standardized. And therefore, it was evolving at a different pace for different purposes, and there's a wide variety of management and operations protocols that we had standardized here at the IETF that weren't being used and weren't being used effectively. And through my career, I've learned that just because I have a TCP connection, I don't have to shove every single feature I've ever thought of, as well as the industry's ever thought of, down that single TCP connection. And different protocols do different things very well, and I wanted to work towards having the industry take advantage of that and also get through the infrastructure phase, because all the action is going to happen once you have a programmable and orchestrated network, as well as services. Interesting. I may be doing this talk from up here. I'll do this talk from here. So back in 91, I made a number of outrageous claims proved only through emphatic assertion, and let's see how some of those came out. What I want to mention just up front, what happened, there's still a massive potential for the IETF to engage with open source communities. Really, it hasn't happened to the extent that the industry needs it to happen, and I'll discuss some of those issues. Many open source communities have formed. There are now a plethora of different communities, many of them homed at the Linux Foundation, and there's a vibrant, very large community around developing networking technologies, which is awesome. That went very, very quickly. Needless to say, different types of stacks, controllers, virtual foo-bars, it's fractured out there, and there's no clear stated trajectory necessarily, and certainly no standardized trajectory that's coming there. And then you can also read the rest. Where that I have on this slide Many of those open source communities are also now standardizing or believe that they're standardizing packet formats, et cetera, within their community and not necessarily bringing those back to the IETF or another standards body, et cetera. So the last thing I want to call up on this slide, and it was from a comment made at the plenary last night, and I'd like you to think about this. Many of us know who are 35-year friends and working here at the IETF, we built our careers here. We were able to advance our careers by working deeply at the IETF. Needless to say, things have changed. Many folks are advancing their careers and deeply engaging in their career path by engaging in open source. And maybe some of the shifts that we're seeing of where people are going are because the advancement of their careers and where they need to go and have on their resume that they're interacting with open source communities and building open technologies, and many of that is there, and so something to contemplate at least. So let's just talk about some of the claims I made in '91. We'll see now 3 years later they weren't in fact that outrageous. So the IETF can take a leadership role. A couple things that have emerged is that the APIs, platforms, and frameworks will be the future standards front for software-driven networking. Second, the same standardization application for those higher level concepts, we need to think through if and which standards body may take on some of those pieces. Of course, it's very interesting if you're trying to standardize an API and you're not involved in the production of the code. Those are almost mutually exclusive, and so something to think about, and we'll get to that in a bit. Can we make the IETF more agile, and perhaps changes in the liaison process and how the IETF was going to work with other SDOs or open source was critical. Call to create more code and ideas. Claims around rough consensus versus parliamentary procedure, as many open source communities derive consensus in a different way, and we'll talk about that. And more running code now. So what is still true is that standard geeks don't necessarily make the best open source geeks, and it's just it's just a claim from our argument here. And really the point is that obviously in open source, code is the coin. And again, it's hard to define APIs and standardize them if you're not involved in the code. And consensus in open source communities is evolved by the state of the code and the coding community. And so therefore, just something to think about, the IETF consensus model that we have and an open source consensus model as that is driven, those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but we haven't figured out a way that those two definitions of driving consensus can come together and how they can communicate. So just, again, something to think about. Next, 91 should have this collaborative loop where people are coding and coming back to the IETF and updating standards, and standard folks are going out and scanning and analyzing the industry and finding out, hey, look, they got that standard slightly wrong, or we've got a technology that they could use, because the IETF produces modules of technology, and open source communities are trying to provide functional solutions to specific use cases and problems. And that, there's quite a bit rich there. So next, when thinking through 91 and the call to embrace good open source, there are foundations that have good neutral third-party management, and how to be able to interact with those foundations was a request. But what I want to call to the orange box on here, and much of that is taken out of what it means to be an RFC with a reference to open source. By design, open source is constantly iterative and moving, and so therefore, as we think about trying to base a reference or base standardized technology on fundamentally a code base and technology that's moving, these are not necessarily diametrically opposed, but they're different. So just quick taxonomy. Again, I'm expecting people in this presentation to be listening and or reading and doing a combination of both. There's a difference between components or modules, platforms, and open reference platforms. And there's some examples embedded in there of what I mean. A virtual switch is a component. A platform is, let's say, a data lake, like the platform for network data analytics. And an open reference platform is something like ONAP, which has been talked about quite a bit in the industry. And that different level of reference and different level of operation also defines the use cases and functionality that those programs and projects and communities are trying to solve. So also what's happened is the Linux Foundation, which is taking a large role in creating that developer community around networking, recently, last May, released a document on how to harmonize SDOs and open source. And the drivers obviously where there's a big rise in open source and operators are using it and they're defining their use cases and solving some of the problems there. And some of the recommendations, again, are fairly high level. And throughout this talk, we'll get down a little bit into some of the nitty or gritty of what we can actually do as the IETF to actually interwork. So next thing I wanted to mention, in the last 3 years, open source foundations in the history of the internet over the last 10 years, every foundation seemed to beget another foundation. I mean, it was biblical how fast those foundations could reproduce. Everybody with a technology or a project wanted to create a new foundation around themselves and have a community. And just to keep this simple, it meant that you had to invest in it. And so in the last several years, the Linux Foundation has taken a number of these different projects and now created umbrella projects. Now, the point here isn't just the overall governance goals. It's that even the organizational structure of communities and how they interplay and interact is fundamentally more dynamic than we may be seeing in standards bodies. And so let's talk about specifically what's happened since '91 in the IETF. Draft was recently put out on how to normatively reference an open source community from that draft. I've talked with those authors at least, and there's a number of pitfalls to avoid. One is that you're chasing behind the code trying to document what it actually did. That is a very challenging path to actually get there. And realizing that open source projects aren't necessitating the need for standard structured documentation, and every community can actually choose the level, quality, and structure of those documents as they like because the code is the documentation. Second, the claim from the IETF that there must be multiple interoperable instances isn't necessarily the goal of that community. They're working quickly, iteratively on one particular architecture for this, and in general, to make my point, if there's major architectural flaws or if there's issues, then another community will form to solve those flaws. And so there's fundamentally different goals of interoperation, because one is solve a problem in a use case that we have, and the goals potentially of that normative reference may not be met. So a couple things that I've talked about with the author here, although again, I think this is critical work. It's necessary but not sufficient to be able to have cross-SDO and open source communication as well as progression together. How do we pick the projects that are within on the list of open source projects that can be chosen for normative reference? Working group going to do this? We're going to do this by consensus? Is a draft author going to pick a winner? Interesting. What are the health and metrics associated with both the technology to be referred to as well as the community surrounding it? A technology can be outrageously stable because there are 0 members of the community actually developing it. Should that be the normative reference? That's my point. And then there's other nuances of working at platforms and APIs. And in particular, that many projects or communities have sub-projects within their architectures. And if you only want to refer to or have a reference, normative reference to one particular module or one particular piece, that needs to be worked through. I think it's critical to be able to normatively reference open source and code, et cetera, but some more work needs to be done here to make this work. Second, and we're going to go into a couple examples right now, the Yang catalog work, which many of you know something about, is an experimentation from the IETF side to create a live set of models for networking devices, keeping it simple, that actually is not trying to produce documents. It's trying to produce live models that can work together, and this becomes critical as an experiment because, frankly, we can show it as a success. And the reason why it was a success, frankly, as you can see listed numerically 1 through 6, a number of tools were built around this for education, for referencing, for compilation, for dependency checking. This is what, searching, et cetera, the application of metadata that we'll talk about to be able to describe and put metrics and variables around the different models. That utility of tooling, and many of you worked on it at the hackathon, became critical. So that metadata from a code point of view becomes one definition of a health metric depending on the data that's put in. But what I personally find most interesting, because I think this is the path forward for SDO relationships and multi-SDO relationships, as well as to open source, is there is a dependency diagram. Instead of having the IETF state in the industry, all Yang models done here, there is a relationship that the Broadband Forum, the MEF, and a wide variety of other SDOs, as well as open source projects, OpenConfig is the big conversation as well, are producing these models for their specific technologies and areas of the industry that they're trying to work on, and this dependency graph actually pulls them together into one unified place, and therefore, with the metadata, the compiler can show that the entire system can work. So this is going to be a recurring theme from here. A couple of other pieces that came out was looking at the communities at the Linux Foundation, the overlap between IETF technology and open source. So this is taking that dependency graph up one level. And what becomes interesting about this in conversations, hopefully within the IETF or catalyzing conversations towards this end, this shows where IETF technology is being used and therefore influence is already occurring and can occur to a greater degree. And it shows where there's a non-overlap. And the IETF can say, we better pay attention here, we better go see what's going on because we have a long history here at the IETF of understanding how to do things securely, et cetera. And perhaps some of these communities can take advantage of that, as well as perhaps we can make sure that the implementation is done well and not causing other issues. Couple lessons from this. Immediately once I said that the data models were live, the goal of this effort, even though sponsored by the IETF, was not the RFC ID. It was being able to point to a live tree of dependent models that together, being worked on independently, create the new way to operate a software-driven network or a model-driven network. And so that's been a fascinating thing to learn about this. And you can see that over 300 modules are now using this. The next one was when we went through the education program, or when the leaders of this project did, it was develop the tools for your customers, and the customers are not necessarily solely the ones at the IETF. It's for these other SDOs and open source communities. And through continued tooling, simplify the development process. So this has been a very good experiment, but as we've potentially talked this week and on email lists about IASA 2.0, all of this work has been privately funded and worked on with these tools have been privately funded, and with the potential process change towards live models referring across SDOs and across open source communities, not saying the private funding is going to dry up, I'm just saying for longevity of the process and or of the tools and to build a community around this, it needs to move to a different level, and that may be part of the role of ISOC or the IETF in IASA 2.0. I want to give you another quick example. It's 1M to M. Very similar. If you're familiar with this, it's related to IoT, just to keep it simple. And if you do work in IoT, you know that it is one of the most fractured industries ever created by mankind. And here's a bunch of logos of the groups that claim to have the sole answer for IoT. That was a joke, by the way. So as we move forward, you can actually place, again, in an architecture, those organizations related to IoT and their relationship together and their dependency on the schemas and models of the data that's being built, and that's what M2M does. And that dependency graph between big organizations, just looking at it at another level, rolls out like this. So I've gotten completely drunk on my Kool-Aid that the way to understand the impact of a technology is not on the RFC ID, but on the product of the RFC. And the product of that RFC is represented by a multi-SDO, multi-open source community dependency graph, which in fact is what the industry ends up using to drive what they need to solve in the industry. So a couple of other things that we tried. Following 91, Yari Arko was the IETF chair at the time. We decided, hey, let's just try something simple. It's being done all over the industry. Let's just bring hackathons to the IETF. And thankfully, we got a chance and continue to work with Charles Eckel, who really brought this together. Here's a picture of all of you hacking just last weekend. And I'll show you in a second, it has become one of the most relevant ways to grow not only IETF participation, but of course, take IETF technology and create open source communities around it. Quick note, once again, those hackathons are privately funded, and if, as an IETF, we actually now want to institutionalize these a bit better, that might be something we want to talk about with IASA 2.0. So at the plenary last night, there was conversations about attendance for IETF, and what you see in blue on the left-hand side is total attendance, and what you see in orange is remote attendance, and you can pretty much eyeball that there's a best fit line and shows declining attendance. And on the right-hand side is hackathon attendance, and you can pretty much eyeball that that's a steeper line increasing, and in fact, the claim that it's the fastest growing part of the IETF community, I think is true. What's interesting, though, with the yellow line are the individuals who are only coming to the hackathon and not staying for the meeting. Interesting to consider whether or not we can do, quote, better outreach to the coders and the developers of the open source community for the technology by simply taking advantage of the folks who are coming to the beginning part of the hackathon. Just a quick bit, this is showing in blue and green between 99 and 100 when we first started asking the question, is this your first IETF and is this your first hackathon, asked to the same people? And sure enough, there's a high correlation to folks showing up to the hackathon who aren't necessarily feeling potentially any membership in working groups at the IETF. And so there's a couple of really big hackathon communities that are constantly being used throughout the history of these hackathons, the Platform for Network Data Analytics, Open Daylight, and FIDO for the forwarding plane. But in reality, I want to make sure that this isn't a complete list nor exhaustive, but it's a really, really long list of IETF technologies that are actually being developed in communities created around that technology here at the IETF, and that is the best news. So therefore, to get the modules of technology that are being created into open source and to get those architectures that I showed you built out of this technology, this is again another path forward that we should think about. So let's take a pause for a second. Why, again, do we care about this? We care about this because the end operators and deployers of networks and of this technology are in fact investing, and this is seen by membership in those open source communities and their investments in those open source communities, that one, they want to learn it, two, they want to understand it, of course, and three, they even want to be able to modify it themselves. Awesome. But they're also doing it for a purpose of simplification. And this is a slide from Bell Canada, which shows, here's the list of current IoT technologies that we have deployed, and the slide isn't even big enough. Now, I have to admit, this also represents a lot of things that I worked on in my career, so a tear is shed, because the list in the middle is, in fact, the new modern technology, IETF technologies that they want to go to, but the way they're consuming those technologies is via those open source projects that I mentioned in the bubble in between. It's a fascinating just transition of network operation to the inclusion of open source. And what are they looking for? Make it simpler. We want to be involved. We want to help code ourselves. We need to understand how this stuff works. So a couple quotes, again, from one from CenturyLink. First, we use open source because it's fast. And again, we want to be involved. And second, from Bell Canada, we want to be able to not only potentially progress the standards, but progress the functionality to solve our problems, and we can do that in code. So let's just do a quick, I promise, a quick talk about what other SDOs have done besides IETF, in case you haven't been following those. First, the MEF has fundamentally changed the trajectory of what they work on based upon their membership. And we'll just talk about this for a second. There's about 210 members, and those are large enterprises and telcos. First, they needed to reinvent themselves. Many folks will remember and have worked on this, where there was an MEF certification for Metro Ethernet equipment in particular, and they were on this cycle, and they weren't able to move quickly enough to evolve to the operational needs of Metro Ethernet. But just a couple of notes for conversation. It's leadership driven not only by the members, but there's a notion of somebody who's directing the strategy for the MEF. And part of it was to understand how to be able to operate, in this particular case, and for my argument, Ethernet circuits and Metro Ethernet circuits. And so they built that architecture that I showed just a second ago that had a notion of orchestration and then model-driven APIs based on Yang to those devices and the services that come from that. We also brought, or Charles Eckel said, hey man, hackathons are working great in other standards bodies and you have this architecture you want to build. Why don't you build that architecture in code as you're also trying to specify this at the same time? So Charles is basically a one-man army out there trying to get standards bodies to realize the value of producing the code at the same time. Second, and this is also fascinating for the IASA 2.0 conversation, the MEF invested in infrastructure, compute, storage, and networking to build, deploy, and certify their new architecture on. It's a play to discuss, again, about the future of the IETF. The MEF, different than the IETF, is a very bounded architecture and therefore bounded target. And once again, you take a look at the tools that are most popular in that standards body, perhaps a shock, perhaps not a shock, very similar to the tools that represent IETF standards, standardized technology as well. But there is always the case that, and it's definitely been the case that there's still a fight out there for SDO relevancy or standards body relevancy, and in some cases a defensive territory. And so there are a ton of SDOs, and they're cropping up all across the industry related to different vertical industries or different parts of the infrastructure like IoT, et cetera. And don't be confused by people staking a flag and saying, this is our turf and work is going to happen. That's obviously not the case. And also, don't try and mop up behind, and I'm going to say that clearly, mop up behind the coders and write specifications over what was done in the code. Oftentimes that code is experimental. So when choosing the partnership with the open source community, a few things to take a look out there. There are a ton, if not more, open source communities. You can see this in the rise in the use of GitHub, et cetera. As mentioned earlier, open source, similar to standards bodies, of course, is driven by potentially larger organizations trying to create strategic market and technology development and set a trajectory. It happens in standards, it happens in open source. That's obvious, but let's just call it out. But if there's going to be an interdependency, open source needs to create competencies to be able to work with standards bodies and vice versa. And again, the liaison mechanism may not be able to do this. So in a little bit of a provocative statement, I put up here where green is good and weird pink is bad, of different standards organizations that have tried to work with the open source model. And as you read some of the details, you can see potentially, or at least what I'm calling out to be the success or failure criteria of those different organizations. And it's not that Cable Labs is doing swimmingly, it's just potentially comparatively to the others, they're finding some success because Cable Labs is not doing swimmingly as well either. So let's just talk about a couple things. So it's frequently been a claim, hey look, other bodies are doing certification. If we have an IETF certification associated with our technology, we'll expand and we'll show our influence over this. There's been failure situations as well as successes. So let's talk about those. One, again, poor specification. In this case, in the Java community, the specification and reputation for that specification became so bad that certification became meaningless. Second, the ETSI NFV architecture and OPNFV, what's interesting is OPNFV is trying to run a certification play and states that they have this alliance with ETSI but doesn't test against that ETSI architecture. Kind of interesting how that all works out. So again, be careful. The one that's primarily claimed to be a great success is 3GPP, where that certification allowed multiple interoperable products to be built. We will see if this works for 5G, whatever 5G is. It's apparently everything, but nonetheless, telephone. Now, the last method of doing this, of course, is a hardware reference design, and open source hardware is becoming a very big deal. We've talked here at the IETF about creating software reference designs for our protocols and modules, not meant to be necessarily productized, but in fact meant to be educational. But the rise of open source hardware platforms is very interesting. And again, it's operator and use case driven for what they see of highest business value, potentially to commoditize one particular piece or another. But really what I think the IETF needs to pay attention to in open source, whether hardware or software, those communities are working directly on use cases to solving problems. And so in the IETF process, which is give me a framework draft, give me a bunch of use case drafts, give me an architecture draft, and when you get all that done, we can go work on the actual technology. This is a great place to go mining for those concrete use cases and communities that are working towards them. So the last one I want to mention back on M2M is the Open Connectivity Foundation, which, very new organization, but here's my point. They have pulled out all the stops. Certification, testing, open source, standards, device models, et cetera. So, new membership funding model. They're now bringing together all the techniques that have been claimed to be successful into one group, but just note that they're bounded on a specific problem, and it's yet to be determined whether or not an industry can support a foundation on potentially such a limited case, even though, of course, IoT is quite large. But mild tangent at this point, which is that how to pick an open source partner. No matter what you hear in marketing, or whatever the case might be, and even in this conversation, because it's open source, it doesn't mean it's magic. Nobody's riding unicorns over rainbows just because it happens to be open source. Remember, it's just code, which means it's the output of people's extremely hard work to solve a problem. And there's a number of startups, certainly where I'm from in Silicon Valley, where startups are banking on becoming a unicorn based upon the Gartner hype cycle associated with that open source community, so beware. But let's just put this into perspective again of standards and open source and how they relate. Here is one example of a reference architecture of an operational stack that's being worked on. And you can see, and it's summarized here instead of bringing in everything that possibly could be brought in, what standards are being used at which layer, which projects are working on these particular pieces. And I find this myself a very good way to understand the early makings of that dependency graph between modules of technology, implementation, open source communities, and then of course, again, trying to solve those architecture pieces. So being a bit more contentious again, I want to then put this into some kind of map for reference. Going in the upwards direction is commercialization versus individual representation, and going from left to right is the notion of free, complete open use to a closed environment, taking a look at potentially some of that open source work. This is just one person's way of putting things into a diagram and onto a map of the commercialization and the influence of specific enterprises and vendors towards the contributions and directions of these groups. You can see where IETF was placed in this particular case. And now, when looking at the partnership goals, are the goals aligned between a standards body and open source community? And the map changes a little bit, and a few more things are added. And so this will end up being one of the cultural, as always, the cultural variable, and whether or not goals are aligned will end up being one of the primary ways to see if the SDO and open source community are going to end up working together. But I want to caution, because just like there's been an aggregation of open source communities, a la Linux Foundation networking project, you know, I've got to call out, especially you know, having Andy right there, call out the evolution from the Frame Relay and ATM forum all the way to the broadband forum, and the aggregation of SDOs that also occurs over time as well. And that easily can happen, and it's important for that to happen as potentially smaller ideas accumulate into larger ones as well. So with a reference back to the social, there's potential for some SDOs or some technologies, as well as open source communities, to be very small fish in a very large aquarium, depending upon how quickly the relationship and interdependency between open source and standards bodies actually occurs. And it kind of depends. And I don't want to say that things become irrelevant if you don't adopt open source. You just, to make my argument, things become niched and very, very specific. And that's still okay. But again, it's the scope of influence in the industry and trajectory is different in this case. So here's the narrative associated with this section really, is that success is when there's going to be friendly communities, open cultures, common goals, and IP alignment. And we'll talk about intellectual property in a second. Because the two failure pieces, one is around intellectual property, and the intellectual property as defined and discussed here at the IETF is fundamentally different than in most of the open source communities. And then there's, of course, the financial model of how all of this is funded. So just quick sum as you're glancing through this slide, many open source projects the intellectual property rights are in that open source license associated with it. And I do want to mention that there is quite a large rise in very permissive licenses like Apache, BSD, or Eclipse in recent years. But you need to really pay attention to the contributor license agreement because that's where some of the real pieces and relationship with the foundations who are governing potentially, or at least running the business operations of those communities, are potentially, again, only potentially adding some overhead. Now, there's a few pitfalls here, again, because open source is expecting usable by anybody and at no charge. And the RAND licensing that we have in some standards bodies is fundamentally different than that. And as you can see in some of these other pieces, this is a real conversation to have, and it's at one scene of the movie, not at the first scene, but at a couple scenes into the movie where are the way that we're thinking about the preservation of intellectual property rights aligned across standards and open source. It always comes down to lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, but nonetheless, these issues are real, and we've had to, of course, work through them. So what I wanted to move to the next section and kind of get to some recommendations maybe I'll talk about in 3 years is standards just creating documents evolve into someone who's building functional code trying to solve problems. But in my opinion, the industry leader of the future is one that is understanding that there are multiple communities that need to be influenced. We have interdependencies between these pieces, is able to work at the code level as well as understanding the structure and need to standardize pieces because it's clear that, that it has to happen. It needs to happen. And is understanding that the output of the work they're doing in technology is setting a trajectory for the industry and therefore is seeing the picture of how the relationship between these organizations work. So there's some choices for the IETF along these lines, from do absolutely nothing and potentially be focused on very specific technology niches, work in the middle and have some communication going back and forth and continue the open door policy of the IETF, which is, hey, if you want to standardize something, come to us. Realize that one of the most important roles in an open source community is in fact community outreach, which is, hey, we're working on this, do you want to work on this together? I'm summarizing what the role is, but that's effectively what the description is. And then for vigorous relevance, consider changing the process. Again, live repositories like in the Yang catalog, as I mentioned earlier, and work realizing that it's a multi-SDO and multi-open source world. So really the meta point of that is, can't look at the world through the keyhole of one particular piece of technology. You have to accept as a technologist that what you're creating has a very specific role in a larger ecosystem. And at least what gets me very excited about being an engineer is getting my technology out there and being used in multiple new and different ways with a larger community that are going to extend it and use it in ways that I never thought of. The next piece here is enable that tooling support. So I've mentioned a couple of times that the creation of this tooling, the IETF has no way to accept this. I have no way to potentially hand over some things that could be compilers, dependency mappers, blah, blah. But that does appear to me to be a fantastic way to understand that relationship, and that tooling is really setting the industry trajectory for how many standards bodies, communities, and organizations will work together and understand their relationship. So taking a look at some open source project genesis, I want to harken back to 3 years that in the early days of SDN and NFV, there were many BOFs, there was many conversations. I even gave a couple of talks on this, that there are things we'd like to standardize here and need to standardize here, whether it's protocols, state machines, events, packet formats, and then all the way up to APIs and platforms potentially. And this organization, and frankly, no other standards or organization really took up that charge. That's okay, that's the way the world unfolded, but that did give rise to these major open source projects that end up creating that de facto standard for those pieces, that these are the events you're going to get and how we're going to build our state machines. So the call here really is, you do need to seek out projects, and I'm going to give you one example at the bottom of Spiffy and and Spire that are fundamentally modifying technologies defined as standards here at the IETF in their open source community and continuing to evolve their code and continuing to evolve their definition of a new standard and specification, it's a certificate format, and say, we'll go back to the IETF at some point when we have time. That is something that a community outreach person would look for and say, no, we're going to help you get this and not necessarily lock it down, but get it defined and written down. So really the point here is the middle sub-bullet, which is that creation of the platform of platforms of these dependency maps also allow you to understand where the open source communities are going and intuit also which technologies could help a particular open source community, et cetera. And so, as has been done, we don't necessarily at the IETF have the notion of relevancy metrics, health metrics associated with a particular standard. We've talked about what makes a successful standard without necessarily applying those metrics across the board to all standards efforts here. But I want to remind you again, there's no academic or theoretical basis of what is the definition or what are the variables of a healthy open source technology and a healthy open source community. And if there's going to be a relationship between standards bodies and open source, those two things need to be understood potentially independently. So as I'm definitely wrapping up here, is that the way that the structure is being done for IASA 2.0 is really just the starting line. The issues of how to modify IETF processes, how to modify potentially funding for doing tooling, et cetera, how to institutionalize hackathons is really just the starting point. But it allows the conversation, which can also occur in parallel, that the RFC ID should not be the only metric for the IETF. And that's really the claim here, that the product of the RFCs is the return on investment and the value associated with the modular technology being created here. And so as you can also see, the notion of iterating standards and certainly live revision control systems containing, in this case, the Yang models, is a really outstandingly positive iterative step of how to do open standards in an open source mechanism using iteration versus drawing lines of versioning, et cetera. And so last to the IETF community, the true community using the technology is much larger than the mailing list of the working groups. And seeking out an understanding and community outreach, and everybody doesn't need to be a community outreach person, but nonetheless, I think the role of a working group chair and the role of an area director here at the IETF and potentially the process needs to work towards that particular piece. And then last, as someone who's works for a company that's done a lot of the private funding for some of these tools and some of these other pieces, I'm really looking for a way to partner with the IETF or partner with ISOC and also partner with open source communities to bring this tooling and create a community around this. Not saying that necessarily the money is going to dry up, but it's not positive for the longevity of this particular idea towards a trajectory if the IETF wants to take it on, to simply have it in private hands. That's my only point there. This is a way that the IETF can directly work in open source because their processes are also driven this way. So I've come to the end of my slides, and I'm willing to take any questions. I made, again, a number of outrageous and contentious statements here, proved merely through emphatic assertion. And so by all means, any questions or comments that you may have, I'd be willing to discuss with you.
Hello. I'm Michael Abrahamson. You had IPR there on one slide. Where do you think we are in 3 to 5 years when it comes to IPR and open source and SDOs? Because everything is getting patented. Like people are paid for the patent, and it's just patent writing machine out there for everybody. Where do you think we are in 3 to 5 years?
So I'm not a lawyer. God only knows what lawyers are going to figure out. I know they'll figure out how to take our money, but other than that, I actually probably see something towards more the open licensing that we see out of Apache, Eclipse, or BSD or something along those lines versus RAND, because RAND that we do at standards, just to summarize my point, is if you can use this if you don't sue me and I won't sue you, and anytime I feel like taking that away, I might do that at my whim. I'm summarizing to make my point. Again, I am not a lawyer, but hopefully it'll be more open than that. Thanks a lot.
Tal Mizrahi, Marvell. You mentioned hardware open source, and obviously it's not evolving as fast as open source software. Obviously, vendors, hardware and silicon vendors are not as interested to go into that very quickly. So I wonder what's your perspective about what we're going to see 3 years from now. Are we expected to see hardware and silicon open source going in the same direction as open source software?
So for example, the open source hardware projects right now do not require an open source of the structure of the chip itself. Instead, it's a reference design, it's an open sourcing of a hardware reference design for a particular platform. And I see this evolving in such that it'll be hardware and software associated with whatever the technology may be, and that the combination of the hardware and software will end up necessarily driving the de facto industry standard of those pieces of what the hardware is expected to do in the orchestration or operations from that hardware. And anytime you see an industry de facto standard mechanism for actually creating products that can be then created by an ODM supplier, et cetera, and brought into the industry, we better have a relationship with those, or otherwise the standards that we write and what they implement and what's deployed are going to be dramatically different. So that's my response.
Hi, Alain Durand. Sometimes in the open source community, you have multiple projects working on the same thing. And similarly in IETF, sometimes we have multiple standards because we just can't agree on just one. Is it a bug or a feature?
It's a feature. And it's a feature because a lot of the implementations have different design patterns, as well as different architectural goals, different functional goals, can scale and or perform in different mechanisms. And that's the purpose of having different design patterns and architectures and software. None of it may have to be standard, and in fact, let's say the eventing APIs, platforms, as well as protocols are fully standardized, but what's in between is dramatically different, and they appear to be working towards the same problem. I encourage it. I think it's a feature, not a bug.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Bron Gondwana. I'm more from the applications world rather than the lower level things. And in our world, certainly, IETF standards come through as a bunch of pros and possibly some ABNF, and implementation quality is very dependent on how well somebody read the standards. In the IMAP world in particular, there's a lot of very bad implementations out there because it's a long, complex standard and people aren't reading it very well. I would say that testing is actually more important than the pros in some ways. We should be having a way to check your implementation against the standard, which isn't read the whole standard and see if you got everything, because that doesn't scale. And where you said you need to automate for it to work, you need to automate testing that your code's correct to implement a standard reliably.
So I agree with you, and what's interesting is that there's at least been one open source community, FD.io, that actually was one of the first to create a functional performance and scaling test framework associated with the open source they were creating, which was matched up against the proper protocol behavior. So I agree with you. It's not necessarily the norm. Now, I want to tease back from just talking about one community and what they do. If a standards body is going to take on the responsibility of testing, they're potentially one step from putting different certification levels on those particular pieces. And that is that needs to be discussed, and a decision needs to be made whether a standards body wants to take on that particular effort, or if that's best left to test suppliers, test vendors, or whatever the case might be, and an entire market forms around that. But as I showed in a couple of my examples of doing testing and certification based upon complex, challenging standards, the standards weren't good enough, the code wasn't good enough, the certification didn't matter because none of the other, see the previous two problems. And so it's not a guarantee that even high quality testing is going to evolve properly.
The comparison point I would give, let's head down again, is acid testing for web browsers. Once the acid test came out and just gave you a score out of 100, how good is your browser? Everyone wanted to have a better score because
Absolutely.
Users could look at this and say, well, your browser only gets 23%, mine gets 25%, mine's better.
And the MEF actually, on the infrastructure side, the MEF actually has that with certification and potentially some caveats.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that as scoring mechanism, but that is beyond necessary, that's an industry scoring mechanism than it is necessarily a standards body scoring mechanism.
Yeah.
In that case. Thank you. The man himself, Charles Eckel.
Yeah, Charles Eckel, thanks. So, first of all, I don't know how many people realized it. But
Closer to the mic.
Wanted to point out that the hackathon really, in large part, came out of some of the challenges you raised 3 years ago, and some of the recommendations of potential paths that you put out. So thank you for that, and thanks for the support to get the hackathon started. I think it's making progress in helping standards move forward more quickly, testing things out before we get too far into the standards, producing running code, proof of concepts, that type of thing. But what you're talking about here made me think that we need to go probably beyond that, and for things to really get deployed to produce code that isn't just a proof of concept, but is actually a usable library, something that's solid and that people can build on top of, something that has good APIs, that type of thing. Is that something that we should tackle within the IETF, or do you think there's other, we should go outside to make that happen and produce those types of libraries?
So when you're talking about trying to create something that solves a functional problem and can be potentially used in production or product, that is actually defining the creation of an open source community. Whether that can be done inside the IETF and can be governed, funded, supported, as well as a community, a developer community inside the IETF or related to the IETF can be created, that's yet to be determined. But if that's a strategic directory that the IETF wants to go on, they potentially could meet that. As you know, hacks are meant to do specific things, and you already went through the litany, and they do that very well. And that's dramatically different than building an open source community. Okay. Thanks, Charles.
Yeah, thanks.
Last question.
Okay. My name is Rich Sauls, and I've been involved in a lot of the similar kind of junctions on a different scale, smaller scale. I think one thing, there's a challenge in this stuff, is that the foundations or the level of infrastructure support you need differs greatly by project. So on the one hand, you have OpenStack, and on the other hand, you have the tiny guy in his garage with the NTP foundation. I think there's an opportunity for the IETF to help this stuff and also tap into some kind of revenue stream if we could set up some kind of thing where it was pretty easy to do a cookie cutter rfc822.org, RFC 547, and it held the nonprofit status, the IPR on the code, and so on. So I think, yeah, it's very intriguing what your talk was about.
I think that's a great conversation for continuing at IASA 2.0 and getting to a point where we can not just discuss the new operational model of the IETF and ISOC relationship as that may be, but the actual goals of the organization, the trajectory we want to be on. So thank you. Hey, so thanks everybody. I appreciate the time today. Hope it was interesting for you and it catalyzes some thought and conversation. Thank you very much.